They said the mountain man had gone mad, buried his wife and child under the snow, then built a cabin no one dared approach. So when folks saw him carry an obese 16-year-old girl across the river, wrapped in his dead wife's shawl, they whispered wicked things. But by spring, that girl would birth a daughter, not of shame but of salvation. What happened up there, between a broken protector and a discarded girl the world called worthless? And why did the whole town, once silent, rally to her side when the preacher came to take her back? Let's begin. When the snow began to melt and the cradle was carved by hand, one promise echoed louder than any prayer. By spring, you will birth our daughter. But what truly happened in that cabin? And who did the saving, him or her? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how deeply stories like this resonate across towns, pasts, and hearts. If you still believe in redemption, dignity, and the strength it takes to protect the vulnerable, then you're already part of this journey. Drop a comment telling me which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The wagon didn't stop. It only slowed enough for the man to reach behind him, grab her wrist, and shove. Clara Belle tumbled backward into the frozen dirt, her weight hitting with a dull thud that knocked the breath from her lungs. Her hands scraped against gravel and pine needles. The wind caught her shawl and flung it like a torn flag. The wagon wheels rumbled on, stirring up dust and judgment, until they disappeared into the pale mist curling over the road. He never looked back. Not once. Clara stayed there a moment, frozen more by disbelief than the November cold, staring at the tracks that faded into the trees like the end of a sentence no one finished writing. Her lip was cracked. One eye was swelling. The bruises on her arms were purple-green mosaics beneath the sleeves of her calico dress, too tight over her swollen stomach. The preacher had called it holy. Her father had called it a deal. She hadn't called it anything. She had never been asked. The forest loomed to the north, thick with black spruce and silence. To the south, the road stretched toward Wilkes Ferry, a town that locked its church doors after dusk and its hearts long before. There was no place to go that wanted her, and no one coming back for her, not even the man who traded her future for 4 jugs of corn liquor and a pocket knife. So Clara Belle rose, shawl dragging, and turned her face to the trees. Each step was effort. Her ankles ached from swelling, her shoes cracked at the toes, her breath came in clouds, each one thinner than the last. But she kept walking, clutching her middle with both hands, whispering words into the dark that only the wind could carry. She whispered to the baby. She didn't know who it would be, a son with her father's eyes, a daughter with her mother's quiet hands. She hadn't seen her mother in 3 years, not since the preacher started coming around with that gold-toothed grin and holy papers signed in blood. By nightfall, the trees thickened, and the air turned mean. Hunger bit deeper than cold. Clara's fingers stiffened around a small bundle tied with twine. 1 biscuit, a scrap of lard, a broken mirror. Her father had tossed it off the wagon after her like a bone to a dog. She broke the biscuit into tiny pieces and swallowed without chewing, hoping to stretch the illusion of food. Coyotes called out in the distance, one howl, then another. They were closer than she wanted to believe. She picked up a stick, not because it would help, but because it felt like trying. Every crack of underbrush sent her heart hammering. Every shadow looked like a pair of yellow eyes. The moon crept through branches like a secret watcher. Clara stumbled once, twice. Her legs didn't want to keep going. She fell against the base of a tree, panting, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion and the quiet, persistent terror that she would die out here and no one would even know her name. But something else stirred. Not fear, not yet hope. Just something like a promise, whispered through clenched teeth. I will not die here. The woods pressed close around her like the pages of a book no one wanted to read. Still, Clara turned another page. The smoke rose thin and silver through the pines, a thread of warmth sewn into the bleak gray sky. Clara Belle saw it just after dawn, through the frostbitten branches, when her legs were so numb she'd stopped noticing the cold. Her lips were cracked, her stomach empty, and her mind dulled by the blur of 1 foot in front of the other. But the smoke meant fire, and fire meant life. She hesitated. The forest had taught her enough in a single night to fear everything. Wolves in the shadows, creaking limbs that snapped like gunshots, dreams of her father's voice hissing that she'd never be wanted. But something stronger than fear, maybe desperation, maybe defiance, drove her legs forward. She followed the scent, wood smoke, pine, and something roasted meat, she thought, or maybe beans. Her mouth watered painfully, and her steps quickened. Soon, she saw it, a cabin, thick-logged and moss-chinked, rising like a dark monolith among the trees. A clearing held it like cupped hands. No path, no fence, no welcome. The windows were small and shuttered, but the chimney smoked steady. A split wood pile leaned against the wall, stacked with almost military precision. Axe marks scarred the stump nearby. Whoever lived here knew survival. Clara reached the steps. Her fingers trembled not just from the cold, and she raised one hand to knock. The door loomed taller than it had any right to, thick as a barn plank, iron-braced, and heavy with silence. She paused. Her other hand gripped her belly, now more bone than fat under the skin. Then she knocked. Once. No answer. She knocked again. A bird startled from the trees. She was just about to turn away when the door swung open. He stood in the doorway like a shadow with breath. A man not just large, but built like the land itself. Broad, weathered, immovable. His beard was grizzled, black streaked with gray. One eye was half-lidded with an old scar that split his brow like a canyon. His clothes were patched, worn, but clean. He said nothing. Clara froze. She couldn't even whisper. He stared at her, and in that stare was no welcome but also no threat, just a long, hard seeing. He looked at her the way storms watch the earth, detached, ancient, and alive. She shifted, half expecting the door to close again, half wanting it to, so she wouldn't have to face what came next. But instead, the man turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back into the cabin. He left the door wide open. Clara stared after him. The warmth poured out like a breath. Inside, the fire snapped in a stone hearth. A pot bubbled. A single chair creaked as he sat. Still no words. Just that open door. Clara stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a sound like judgment. The cabin was warmer than any place Clara Belle had ever known. The heat from the stone hearth wrapped around her limbs, melting the cold from her bones and pulling tears she hadn't meant to shed. She stood still just inside the threshold, unsure whether to step farther or retreat. The man didn't speak, didn't look at her. He stirred the iron pot above the flames with slow, steady movements, as though her presence were no more than another shadow in the room. She glanced around. The place was rough-hewn but cared for. One table, one chair, a cot by the far wall covered in thick quilts, and a row of shelves stacked with tins, jars, and folded cloth. Tools hung in perfect order from pegs. A rifle rested on the mantel, gleaming clean. Everything had a place. She felt like a mistake just standing there. Finally, the man stood and ladled stew into a tin bowl. He set it on the table and pushed it toward her without a word. Clara hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, she pulled the chair back and sat. Her weight made the legs creak, but he didn't flinch. She picked up the spoon and tasted it: beans, salt pork, and potatoes soft enough to swallow without chewing. She nearly wept into the bowl. He watched her eat for a while, silent. Then, in a voice low and flat as a stone dropped in water, he spoke. "You stay, you work, you take what's given, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't ask questions." Clara paused mid-bite. He nodded toward the back of the cabin, where a narrow door sat closed beneath a beam that looked darker than the rest. "You don't go in there. Ever. That room's locked for good reason." She didn't nod, didn't answer. She just stared at her food. "You hear me?" She gave the smallest nod. "I don't hit," he said then, voice even lower. "I don't touch. You're safe here, long as you follow the rules." Clara looked up at that. For a flicker of a second, she saw his eyes ice gray, set deep in a face weathered like bark. And behind that ice, something burned. Not anger, something older. He turned away and began cleaning the pot. She finished the stew in silence. Later, as dusk pulled shadows through the small windows, she curled in a corner near the fire, wrapped in an old quilt. He gave her space, laid an extra blanket beside her, and settled onto the cot without ceremony. When she awoke in the middle of the night to stoke the fire, she caught sight of a name carved into the underside of the mantel. S. Cain. Silas Cain. She knew the name. Everybody from Wilkes Ferry to Coleridge did. The mountain man, the killer, the ghost who tore 6 bounty hunters apart after the sheriff sent them to collect a debt he never owed. Clara stared into the flames, bowl resting beside her, belly warm for the first time in weeks. He hadn't asked her name, he hadn't cared, but he hadn't turned her out either, and he'd fed her, without a word. The morning came quiet, seeping in through the chinked logs like a breath held too long. Clara Belle blinked into the pale light that filtered through the shuttered window, unsure for a moment where she was. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the quilt over her shoulders was heavier than she remembered. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff but warm, her skin no longer screaming from cold. Her cheek throbbed where the bruise was healing, but the sting had dulled. She touched it softly, then lowered her hand to her belly. Still there, still growing. The table had something on it, a small loaf of dark bread, thick crusted and still faintly warm. Next to it, a tin cup of water and a slice of dried apple. No note, just provision. She sat at the table, tore a piece of the bread, and chewed slowly, letting it soften in her mouth. The silence wasn't cruel here. It didn't threaten. It simply waited. After eating, she moved to the bucket near the hearth and filled it with melted snow from the tin pot. She found a rag and knelt to scrub the floor wood dark with years of use, scuffed but solid. Her knees ached and her back groaned, but her hands worked without thought. She wasn't doing it because he asked. He hadn't said a word since last night. She did it because the warmth inside her was growing, and not just the baby. Through the small front window, she saw him outside. Silas Cain, a great bulk of a man moving like wind through the trees. He lifted the axe over his shoulder and brought it down in smooth, practiced swings, splitting logs with a rhythm that felt older than the forest. Snowflakes settled on his shoulders. He didn't brush them off. He worked like someone who didn't need the world to notice. When he came back in, he stamped snow from his boots and set a new armload of wood by the hearth. He glanced at the clean floor, then at her. She didn't meet his eyes. He grunted, whether approval or indifference, she couldn't say, and went to his tools. Later, when he left again, Clara found a strip of birch bark near the stove, curled at the edges and pale as old bone. She found a stub of charcoal in a drawer, half used but still marking. She didn't think her hand moved before her heart did. She drew the shape of his shoulders first, broad, sloped, like the ridgeline of a mountain. His beard came next, thick and tangled like thicket brush, and the hard line of his brow. The scar was hardest, not because it was complicated, but because it said the most. She tried to make it quiet. She made his eyes softer than real life. She didn't mean to. She was shading the last shadows under his collar when the door creaked. She startled, turning too fast, the bark slipping from her fingers. He stood there, watching. Clara froze. Her throat dried. He walked past her without a word. She gathered the bark, ready to hide it, to burn it, to pretend it hadn't happened. But when she turned, she saw him at the shelf. He pulled something out of a tin box and held it out to her. A knife. A tiny one, no bigger than her finger, but sharp. She stared. "For the tip," he said, voice like distant thunder. She took it slowly. The pencil she'd used was sharpened that night to a perfect point. The sun had just begun to slip behind the pines when Clara heard the rustling. She was in the chicken coop, reaching for the feed sack, her apron hem caked in thawed mud, her hands raw from scrubbing out the nesting boxes. The hens clucked lazily, uninterested in the tension stiffening her shoulders. Something beneath the straw moved, not like a hen, not like anything she recognized. It hissed, low, bone deep. She froze. The sound came again. Clara slowly turned her head, heart thudding, breath caught halfway between scream and silence. There, just inches from her boot, coiled and ready, was the thick, dusty body of a rattlesnake. Its eyes were like glass beads. The rattle at its tail twitched once. Clara couldn't breathe. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. She thought of the baby. She thought of dying alone in the dirt. Then a shadow moved behind her. A blur, a rush of air. The snake's head vanished in a single strike, steel flashing down so fast she only registered the thunk of the hatchet against the ground. Blood spattered across the coop floor. The chickens shrieked and flapped, straw flying in all directions. Silas Cain stood over the dead snake, his hatchet embedded in the dirt. His jaw was tight, his shoulders still. For a moment, the only sound was the settling wings of the hens. Clara stumbled back, clutching her middle. Silas bent, grabbed the snake by the tail, and tossed it into a grain sack like it was nothing more than trash. He didn't look at her. "Next time," he muttered, "don't reach without checkin' first." She nodded, but he was already walking back toward the cabin, his broad back framed in the bleeding colors of dusk. That night, after the fire was stoked and the cabin had sunk into its usual silence, Clara found something on her bed. A red wool scarf, folded neatly, lying across her pillow like an invitation or a memory. The fabric was soft, not the kind you wore for work or warmth, but the kind you saved for church or Sundays. It smelled faintly of cedar and something older like time. She picked it up gently, unsure if it was for her or if it had simply been misplaced. But Silas wasn't careless. He didn't leave things lying around. Every nail, every tool, every pail had its place. If the scarf was there, it was meant to be. She wrapped it around her neck. It was warm, warmer than it should have been. She didn't ask where it came from. Later, as the wind scraped against the shutters and the fire cast long shadows on the log walls, Clara watched Silas in his chair. He sat still, a tin cup of whiskey resting heavy in his hand. The bottle was half gone. His eyes stared into the fire like it might burn away whatever haunted him. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But the red scarf stayed on her neck all night. And for the first time, her dreams were not of running, but of being watched over. The scream ripped through the cabin before the dawn could break. Clara shot upright beneath her quilt, heart pounding, breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, only that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Then she heard it again, a groan low and guttural, torn from deep in a man's chest. She turned. Silas lay on the cot, twisted in the quilt, his great shoulders taut with agony. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes shut tight as he muttered through clenched teeth, "Annie." The name was like a prayer spat out in pain. "Lil Sarah?" "No, no, God, no." Clara didn't move. She watched, breath shallow, unsure if waking him would make it worse. But as quickly as it had started, the storm passed. He stilled, shoulders slackening, breath slowing into something like peace. Silence reclaimed the room, broken only by the pop of a coal collapsing in the hearth. She didn't sleep after that. Later, the day moved quietly. Clara fed the hens, drew water, and swept the porch without being told. Silas said nothing, just split wood with more force than usual, each swing of the axe echoing through the clearing like thunder. His eyes stayed distant, like he was watching something only he could see. It was just after supper, beans and salt pork, eaten in silence, that he stood without a word and walked out the cabin door. Clara waited a beat, then followed, her scarf tight around her neck and her boots crunching softly in the snow behind his. He didn't look back, didn't speak, just walked past the coop, beyond the line of pine trees that circled the cabin like sentries. The light was fading, but not gone, and the air smelled of cold earth and pine sap. He stopped at a small rise just past the edge of the clearing. There, 2 wooden markers leaned against the base of an old oak, weathered but steady. No names carved, no dates, just one tall, one short. Silas stood still for a long time, staring down at the graves. His hands hung at his sides. His breath came slow. Clara approached quietly, heartful and aching. She didn't need him to explain. The names from the nightmare were enough. She knelt and brushed snow away from the smaller marker. From her pocket, she pulled a small purple bloom wild heather she'd found near the stream days ago and pressed in her sketchbook. She laid it gently at the base of the wood. Still, he said nothing. She didn't expect him to. They walked back together, not touching, not speaking. The space between them had changed, softened somehow. That night, after the fire was built up again, and the silence settled in its usual place, Silas didn't retreat to his cot. He pulled his chair closer to the hearth, where Clara already sat, sketching on a scrap of birch bark. He didn't look at her drawing. He just sat, whiskey untouched at his feet, and stared into the flames with a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She didn't ask what he saw in the fire. She already knew. The days stretched long and quiet as the snow deepened, settling over the mountains like a wool blanket, soft and heavy. Clara fell into the rhythm of the cabin without needing to be told. Her hands, once clumsy from hunger and bruises, found work to do, wood to stack, bread to knead, pots to scrub, and, more often now, needle and thread to guide through bits of torn flannel and faded cotton. She sewed at night, mostly. The firelight warmed her fingers as she stitched uneven stars and crooked birds into squares of old shirts and feed sacks. They weren't perfect, but they were hers, pieces of the days she'd survived and the quiet she was learning to trust. Silas said little, but he watched. He'd glance at the fabric in her lap and grunt once, like the sound a man makes when he finds something respectable. It wasn't praise, exactly, but it sat warmer in her chest than anything she'd known before. The cabin changed too, slowly. She tacked one finished square above her cot, then another over the cracked window frame. Color crept in blues, soft reds, yellow thread that caught the firelight. The space grew less like a cave and more like a place people lived, not just hid. But one thing never moved: the photograph on the mantel. It was black and white, faded at the edges, the corners curled. A woman sat stiff-backed, hair pinned high, her face soft but unsmiling. A baby in her lap wore a white dress, one hand caught mid-reach. The glass was cracked across the corner, like someone had once thrown it down and then thought better of it. Clara looked at it every night while she stitched, wondering. One evening, as wind moaned outside and snow piled higher against the door, she found her voice. Was that her? Silas looked up from his chair, where he sat sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes. He didn't ask what she meant. He never had to. He set the blade aside. Yes. He stared at the photo. His mouth moved once, then stopped. Then again. Annie, he said. She was the kind that could calm a dog just by looking at it. Taught school down in Hollow Ridge. Read books out loud like they were songs. I was no one. Just a miner with 2 busted hands and a temper. She married me anyway. Clara didn't speak. She let him go on. We had a little girl, Sarah, born in March, died in December. He paused. His eyes didn't move from the photograph. House fire. Stove exploded while I was at work. They said Annie tried to get out, but smoke took her, took the baby too. His voice cracked, the break so small it almost passed unnoticed. Almost. I wasn't there, and I've never been nowhere since. Clara folded her quilt square in her lap, fingers pressing it flat. I'm sorry, she whispered. Silas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. His shoulders shook once, then again. It wasn't a sob. It was quieter than that, like something caving in slow after standing strong too long. She didn't touch him, just sat there, the fire between them, and kept the silence from becoming something cruel. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the truth finally lived where the ghosts had been. The snow had begun to melt in patches, just barely. Little rivulets ran along the edges of the clearing, tracing paths through the mud where the ice had surrendered. The air still bit, but the wind had lost its teeth. Spring was whispering beneath the ground, even if it hadn't yet found its voice. Inside the cabin, the warmth felt different, not just from the fire, but from the way time had settled between them, no longer brittle, no longer braced for breaking. Clara had taken to humming as she sewed, soft, tuneless notes that filled the space between silence and song. She was piecing together a quilt square in the shape of a sunrise gold thread stitched around jagged triangles of orange and pink, cut from an old calico apron Agnes had left behind. Her tongue stuck slightly from the corner of her mouth as she worked, brows furrowed in concentration. Silas sat in his chair whittling, not for need, just for something to do. A thin curl of wood dropped to the floor with each pass of his knife. Clara made a mistake in her stitch, looped the thread too tight, tugged too hard, and the fabric puckered awkwardly. She groaned and leaned back, scowling at the lumpy patch. It's ugly, she muttered. Silas glanced up. It's honest, he said. She rolled her eyes, but the corners of her mouth twitched. Honest ain't always pretty. No, he agreed, but it's always better than pretty that lies. That's when it happened without thinking, without warning. Her lips curved fully, and Clara Belle smiled. Not just a twitch or a half laugh, a real smile, wide and unabashed. Her teeth were crooked and yellowed from years of poverty and neglect, her gums uneven, her mouth wide. But her eyes sparkled with something deeper than joy, something closer to freedom. Silas looked at her, startled at first. Then, after a beat, he chuckled, not a dry grunt or a polite exhale, but a warm, surprised sound that bounced off the log walls and settled into the floorboards like it belonged there. Clara froze. She'd never heard him laugh before. She blinked, then laughed too. Her shoulders shook, and her belly rolled with it, and the room filled with something it had never known light. Silas leaned back, arms crossed, a slow grin tugging at his beard. "You got light in you, girl," he said, his voice soft, like he wasn't sure he should speak it aloud. "Light don't care if it's dirty." Clara looked at him, unsure if she should thank him or cry. Instead, she said, "Neither do I." They sat like that for a while, the fire crackling, the world outside still wrapped in thaw and silence. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Not everything had healed, not everything ever would, but a girl with yellow teeth had smiled, and a man with blood on his hands had laughed, and that, somehow, felt like the beginning of spring. The day began like any other. Thin morning light filtered through the shutters, soft and gray, and Clara stirred beneath her quilt, the weight of sleep still heavy in her limbs. Silas was already gone from his cot. She could hear the steady rhythm of axe strikes outside, that familiar cadence that had come to mean safety, steadiness, life. She took her time rising, the child inside her shifting as she moved, a quiet flutter that reminded her she wasn't alone anymore, not truly. She pressed her hand to her belly, breathed deep, then stoked the fire and warmed the last of the bread from yesterday. It was when she stepped onto the porch, the cold biting at her cheeks, that she saw it. A scrap of paper nailed to the fence. It flapped slightly in the wind, held fast by a rusted horseshoe nail, and there were hoofprints in the snow fresh. Whoever left it hadn't stayed long. Clara walked to it slowly, her breath catching with every step. Her gut knew before her eyes read the words. The handwriting was sharp, all pressure and anger. "Return the girl. She is with sacred child, consecrated by agreement. The Lord has claimed her womb. She is not yours. She belongs to the church. As was agreed with her father, there will be consequences." No signature, but she knew who'd written it. The language was unmistakable. Her father hadn't the patience for scripture, but the preacher did. He'd paid good coin for her, right there at the supper table, while her father nodded, drunk and grinning. Clara tore the letter from the fence with shaking hands, the nail dragging a splinter behind it. Her heart thudded loud in her ears. The old shame came flooding back, dark and thick and cruel. She turned and found Silas standing at the edge of the clearing. He had seen her before she saw him. He stood still, axe in one hand, eyes locked on the paper in hers. He didn't ask, just walked toward her in silence. She handed him the letter. Her hands trembled. Her throat refused to work. Silas read it once, then again. Then, without a word, he walked past her to the hearth inside the cabin. Clara followed, slow and unsteady. He held the paper to the flame. The fire caught at once, curling black along the edges. It crumbled into ash in his fingers. Still, he said nothing. But Clara broke. The sobs came sudden and hard, pulled from some deep place inside her she'd tried to board up. She sank to the floor, one hand on her belly, the other pressed to her mouth to muffle the sound. Silas knelt beside her. He didn't touch her, he never did, but his presence wrapped around her like a wall against the storm. "He don't own you," he said, voice low and steady. "Neither does that church, or that preacher, or the past." Clara looked up, her eyes red, her face blotched with grief. "You stay as long as you want. Ain't no man taking you from here, not while I breathe." The fire crackled behind them. The letter was gone, but its shadow lingered. "Still," Clara breathed, and for the first time since she was cast off like something broken, she believed she could stay. The night sky turned orange, not gradually, but all at once, like someone had poured fire into the horizon and let it spill over the ridge. Clara stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring at the unnatural glow bleeding through the trees. It didn't flicker like lightning, didn't dance like a lantern. It pulsed, steady, ominous, alive. Silas was behind her, standing in the doorway. He hadn't said a word yet, but his body had gone still the moment the light broke the darkness. No birds called, no wind moved. The air was thick with meaning. She turned to look at him. His jaw was set. "Is it fire?" she asked, voice small. He didn't answer right away. Then, "Yeah." "Is it one of yours? A burn?" Silas shook his head once. "Not this time." The cabin's shadows moved as he crossed the threshold. He opened the chest near the hearth, the one he never touched in front of her, and pulled out a long, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. With practiced care, he unrolled it on the table. Inside, his axe, a hunting knife, a flintlock pistol. Everything sharp, everything clean. Clara stepped inside slowly, heart knocking. "Is it them?" she asked. He didn't look at her, but his hands worked fast. He touched each weapon like a man blessing old friends. "It's a message," he said. "They want us to know they're close. Raisin Daddish." The firelight caught the hard lines of his face as he sat and began sharpening the axe, pulling the whetstone slow and steady down the edge. Clara swallowed. "What if they come tomorrow?" Silas didn't stop sharpening. "Then tomorrow, they come." He paused, set the axe down, and looked at her finally, fully. "If they come," he said, "you stay hidden, under the floor, like we talked. You don't make a sound, and you don't open that trap until I come for you, not for anything. But I don't break promises." His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "And I promised myself, the day I buried Annie and Sarah, no girl under this roof gets hurt again. Not ever." Clara felt the tears press behind her eyes, but she bit them back. She nodded. He went back to the axe, dragging stone against steel. Over and over, the cabin held its breath. Outside, the mountain glowed brighter. Smoke began to drift low between the trees, just enough to sting the throat. Silas didn't flinch. He worked like a man who'd seen worse, and wasn't afraid to see it again. Clara sat near the fire, hands resting on her belly, the red scarf looped tight around her neck. She watched the sparks jump in the hearth, and wondered what kind of man lights a fire just to be seen, and what kind of man sharpens steel in silence. The answer to both, she suspected, would arrive by morning. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and sure, like someone who didn't ask for permission because they didn't need it. Clara looked up from where she sat, darning a sock, heart skipping. Silas, across the room, reached for the rifle leaning by the hearth, but he didn't lift it, just held it loosely, watching the door. The knock came again, followed by a voice low, no nonsense, familiar. "Don't shoot, Silas Cain. It's just an old woman with tired feet and a sharp tongue." Silas exhaled through his nose and set the rifle down. "It's Agnes," he muttered, mostly to himself, and walked to the door. Clara stood as he opened it. The woman who stepped inside was wrapped in a thick wool cloak, boots caked with trail mud, her silver hair braided and tied at the back. Her eyes were pale green, fierce as spring lightning, and she carried herself like someone used to catching babies and calling men fools. Agnes looked around once, her gaze sweeping the room like a broom. "Still dark in here," she said, "still quiet." Then she looked at Clara and softened, just a touch. "You must be the girl." Clara nodded. "Clara Belle? Well then." Agnes peeled off her cloak, revealing thick arms and a practical dress, patched but clean. "Let's have a look at you, Clara Belle." Clara glanced at Silas, who nodded once and stepped outside. The moment the door shut, Agnes crouched by the fire and gestured to the quilt Clara had draped across her lap. "Lie back, child. I've caught more babies than years you've lived." Clara obeyed, nervous but oddly comforted by the woman's sure hands. Agnes pressed gently, her fingers skilled and warm even through the chill. She asked no questions, just listened to Clara's breathing and watched her eyes. After a moment, she sat back on her heels, wiped her hands on her apron, and nodded. "By spring," she said matter-of-factly, "you'll birth a daughter." And needed, said with a feint. Clara blinked. "A girl?" There's a roundness in your belly that says softness, not fight, Agnes said, standing. She'll come fast when she comes, and hard, so you'll need to rest. You'll need quiet, clean food, steady hands nearby. She turned toward the door. And a man who'd kill to protect you. The door creaked open again as Silas stepped back in, snow dusting his shoulders. Agnes eyed him. That's still you, Cain? He grunted. Agnes smirked. Didn't think so. Silas raised a brow. You done? I'm never done, she said, but her tone was light now. She patted Clara's hand. You stay warm. Don't lift anything heavier than a quilt. And if your back aches low and sharp, you tell him, I'll come running. She gathered her cloak and moved toward the door. Before stepping out, she paused beside Silas. You kept her safe. Keep doing it. And don't be stupid when the fire reaches your doorstep. He didn't answer, just held the door open. Agnes left with the same certainty she'd arrived, her footprint swallowed quickly by the snow. Clara exhaled slow, her hand drifting to her belly. A daughter. Silas didn't speak, but he sat down beside the fire, closer than usual. Close enough that Clara felt, for the first time, the weight of protection, not as fear but as shelter. The town of Wilkes-Barre stirred early, as it always did, but there was something sharp in the air that morning, like the snap of laundry just before a storm. It wasn't the weather, though the wind had a bite. It was the talk, the kind of talk that twisted itself between fence posts, passed like folded notes in pews, and gathered in tight knots outside the general store and the barber's porch. They said the mountain man had taken her, that fat girl Clara Belle, the one with the shameful belly and the bruises she never explained. They said he'd lured her into the woods, that he'd hold her up in his cabin, that God knows what went on up there in that godless place. Preacher Roland made sure they heard it. He rode into town at mid-morning, black coat flapping behind him, Bible in one hand, a flintlock holstered on his hip. He didn't shout, but his voice carried all the same. The girl is mine, he said, standing on the church steps, as if he were a prophet and not a man who'd once traded a bottle of whiskey and $5 for a child's womb. She carries a holy child, consecrated to the Lord. That mountain man has taken what belongs to God, and I mean to get her back. A few men nodded. A few more looked away. The sheriff, old Ben Thatcher, chewed his tobacco slower than usual and didn't say a word. He had no love for Silas Cain, but no appetite for war either. Roland continued, voice like oil spilled on dry wood. We'll ride up before the week is out. Any man with spine and scripture in his heart ought to come. Evil has claimed her, but we can still cleanse it. Agnes stood at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, mouth drawn into a line that looked carved from stone. She said nothing until Roland disappeared into the church with his followers trailing behind. Then she turned, without ceremony, and walked to the bakery, where the women gathered like they always did, kneading dough, counting children, sharing burdens no preacher ever saw fit to carry. Inside, she spoke low and steady. He's lying, she said. That girl wasn't stolen. She was discarded. You all know what he did, what he paid, what he's done before. They shifted, glanced at one another, shame creeping into their faces like smoke under a door. She's a child, Agnes continued, carrying more than just a baby. She's carrying fear, shame, silence, and Silas Cain's the only soul who's treated her like a person since the day she bled. No one interrupted. I've seen her, held her belly in my hands. There's a daughter coming, and I'll be damned if I watch a preacher rip her from safety in the name of righteousness. One woman, Martha Cray, whose own daughter had run off years ago and never written, nodded. Then another. Agnes looked around the room, her voice just above a whisper. When the men ride, we ride too, and we don't ride behind. By nightfall, the town still hummed with gossip. But now, beneath the noise, something stronger stirred. Not just whispers, resolve. The days passed in silence, but the silence had changed. It no longer hung heavy like judgment, but settled gentle, like snow after a storm. Clara filled the cabin with the quiet scratch of charcoal on birch bark, her fingers always smudged with ash and dust. She drew by the fire, at the table, on the porch, when the weather allowed. It began without planning first, a sketch of the snake, its body mid-coil, eyes like pins, head severed cleanly. Then the fire on the horizon, tongues of flame licking the dark trees in a way that seemed almost alive. She didn't just draw what she saw. She drew what she felt. One morning, she drew the grave markers behind the cabin, two simple pieces of wood under the shadow of the oak, snow melting around their base. But in her drawing, Clara added a third marker beside them, untouched, unnamed, a blank space, not for mourning, but for memory not yet made. When Agnes returned 2 days later with jars of pickled beans and a new tin of thread, she saw the drawings pinned neatly near the hearth. "These are stories," she said, lifting one gingerly. "You don't just draw, Clara Belle. You tell the truth with a piece of bark and a bit of burnt stick." Clara ducked her head. "It's just drawing." "No," Agnes said, pointing to the picture of the fire, where Clara had hidden the shape of a cross in the smoke. "It's a voice, and God knows you've earned one." Later that night, Silas returned from checking the snares. His coat was dusted with snow, and his boots left thick prints across the floor. Clara was bent over her work, her belly pushing awkwardly against the table's edge. She didn't notice him at first. He stood behind her and watched in silence. The picture she worked on was larger than the others, sketched on a flattened piece of bark pieced from several strips. At the center was Silas, standing tall but not alone. His hand rested on Clara's shoulder, and in her arms was a small bundle, clearly a baby, but its face left unfinished. Just a soft circle, waiting. Silas didn't speak, didn't move. Clara sensed him and tensed. She started to pull the drawing away, embarrassed, but he reached past her, took the finished picture, and walked to the far wall. With a nail and his hunting knife's hilt, he pinned it to the logs beside the mantel, just above where the red scarf always hung. It stayed there, quiet and still, watching over the room. Clara sat back, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked softly. Silas looked at the picture, then at her. "Because it's true," he said. She turned toward the fire, arms wrapped around her belly, and let the warmth reach deeper than skin. For the first time, she imagined what it might be like to be seen, not for her weight, or her past, or the child growing inside her, but for what she could make, for what she already was. The wind rose like a warning. It howled down from the peaks, thick with ice and the scent of coming snow. The trees bent under its weight, and the clouds above coiled low and gray, heavy with storm. But the cold did not stop the march. Preacher Roland led them, his black coat flaring behind him, his rifle slung across his chest like a cross of judgment. Behind him rode 6 men, some with law badges, some with whiskey in their veins, all with rifles and torches clenched tight. They didn't speak. Their horses snorted, restless, hooves biting into the frost-hardened earth as they made their way up the winding path that led into Silas Cain's woods. Roland's voice carried, even without words. It was in the set of his shoulders, the certainty in his stride. He was not coming to talk, he was coming to take. But behind them, 50 paces down the trail, came another group, slower, quieter. A line of townspeople stretched in coats and shawls, boots wrapped in cloth, lanterns held high. Women walked with their children, old men with worn eyes and folded hands. Some carried nothing. A few held tools, makeshift weapons, a pitchfork, a carving knife, a walking stick too straight to be for balance alone. Agnes walked among them, head high beneath her wide-brimmed hat, shotgun slung over one shoulder and her free hand gripping a bag of clean cloths and bandages. She had spoken to each of them before they left, not pleaded, not begged, just reminded them of the truth. She was sold, she'd said. He bought her like cattle, and now he wants her back wrapped in the word. But she's not cattle, she's not property. She's a girl who's suffered and found shelter, and we will not let that be taken. And so they marched into the teeth of a rising storm. Up the mountain, Silas stood in the yard, sleeves rolled, tools laid out on the porch like instruments before surgery. He'd reinforced the door with a second beam, dragged heavy barrels in front of the windows, and loaded his rifle with care. Clara watched him from the doorway, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the red scarf like it could keep her from unraveling. "They're really coming," she said. He nodded. "By nightfall, I reckon." She looked at him. "Will you kill them?" He looked at her. "I'll stop them." She didn't ask more. She only turned back inside, where the fire burned hot and the birch drawings fluttered on the walls. The family portrait still hung where he'd nailed it. The first flakes began to fall before midday, thin, swirling, then heavier. By the time Agnes arrived, stepping through the trees like a ghost with steel in her hands, the storm was thick enough to swallow sound. She didn't knock. "Front window's your weakest point," she said, stepping inside. "I'll cover it." Silas handed her a box of cartridges. Clara sat by the hearth, stomach tight, heart steady. The baby inside her kicked once, hard and clear. She pressed her hand to the place and whispered, not in fear, but in promise, "No one's taking you." Outside, the torches drew closer, flickering like angry stars through the snow. Dawn came pale and heavy, dragging behind it a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Snow blanketed the clearing, muffling every step, every breath. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was deeper than before, like the mountain itself was waiting. Silas stood outside the cabin, rifle across his chest, breath rising in slow clouds. His coat was dusted white at the shoulders. Behind him, Clara stood just inside the doorway, wrapped in the red scarf and one of Agnes's thicker shawls, her hands resting low on her belly. Agnes sat by the window, shotgun laid across her lap, eyes sharp. They came into view like ghosts from the trees. Preacher Roland, first mounted and proud, dark coat flapping like a crow's wing. Behind him, the 6 armed men trudged through the snow, rifles drawn, expressions flat and grim. But they weren't alone. The townspeople had followed, slow and quiet, standing behind the preacher's men in a loose arc. Some held tools, some simply stood, faces grim, weathered, watching. Roland pulled his horse up short, nostrils flaring steam, and raised his voice. "Silas Cain, you are harboring what ain't yours. That girl is mine by spiritual contract and agreement with her lawful kin. She carries the Lord's child, and she will be returned to his service." Clara stiffened. Silas said nothing. Roland's eyes snapped to her, visible just behind the door. "Girl, you come now. This is your last offer before things turn." His voice turned sharp. "You've played the harlot long enough." A murmur rose from the crowd. Not loud, but not silent either. And then Clara stepped forward. She moved past Silas, her boots crunching over snow, slow but steady, and faced the preacher with the whole town watching. Her heart pounded so hard it shook her limbs, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "I wasn't given to God. I was sold to you. I didn't ask. I didn't agree. My father traded me like a mule, and you called it sacred." She turned to the crowd. "You all knew. You saw the bruises. You looked away." A hush fell, deeper than snow. "I was raped. I was beaten. I was discarded. He," she said, gesturing to Silas, "found me starving and broken, and he never once laid a hand on me. He gave me food, gave me fire, gave me space to heal." Roland's face reddened, fury blooming beneath his skin. "Lies! She's poisoned. That man is a murderer and a thief." Agnes stepped forward then, slow and deliberate, holding a folded paper in her hand. "This is a land deed," she said, voice calm as winter. "Found it behind the church ledger, signed by Clara's father, sealed with his mark. It shows he took payment from Roland land and coin for Clara's womb. No guardianship, no consent, just barter." She handed it to the sheriff, who stepped from the crowd, face tight. He read it, said nothing, then looked up. "Roland," he said, voice flat, "you're under arrest for unlawful purchase of a minor, fraud, and coercion. Dismount." The preacher's face contorted, torn between rage and disbelief. "You'd take her word over mine? I've heard hers. Yours is just noise." The sheriff motioned. 2 of the deputies stepped forward, guns raised. Roland's men hesitated, then lowered their weapons. The preacher dismounted, cursing under his breath, hands shaking. They cuffed him, led him away. Silas exhaled, slow and deep. Clara stood in the snow, the scarf bright against the pale world, her head held higher than ever before. She hadn't just survived, she had been heard. The preacher's curses grew quieter as they dragged him down the trail, his boots scraping through the snow, wrists bound behind him. The townspeople began to disperse, first in trickles, then in small groups. their breath forming little clouds of questions that no one said aloud. Agnes stayed behind, posted by the porch like a stone guardian, her shotgun resting in the crook of her elbow, her mouth set in a tight line. Clara didn't notice the silence that followed. All she could hear was the soft crunch of Silas's boots behind her until they stopped. She turned just in time to see him stagger, one step back, then another. And then, as if the fight had drained out of him all at once, he fell. Silas! She was at his side in a heartbeat, her knees in the snow, her hands catching his shoulders. He was breathing, but shallowly. His coat was dark at the ribs. Blood, she realized, seeping through wool. Agnes knelt beside her. He's been hit. I didn't see. Neither did he. That's how it goes sometimes. They got him inside together. Laid him on his cot, peeled back the coat, the shirt. The wound was deep but clean. A bullet, likely stray, had torn just beneath the ribs. Not fatal, Agnes said, but fever would try to change that. Clara stayed beside him. Through the night, through the second day, through the waves of heat and shivering cold. She mopped his brow, changed the cloth, whispered soft words that she wasn't sure he could hear. The fire never died, neither did she. He murmured nonsense through the worst of it. Names, sometimes. Annie, yes. Sarah, often. Once, he whispered something she didn't catch but knew in her bones wasn't meant for ghosts, it was meant for her. By the third morning, the thaw had begun. She heard at first the ice at the creek, cracking like old bones as the water underneath finally broke free. The sound echoed through the trees, soft but steady, like the land itself was breathing again. She opened the cabin window just enough to let the sound in, let the world know it was time. Inside, Silas stirred. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy at first, then clear. He looked at her, her hand in his, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, hoarse but steady, "Still here." Clara nodded, the tears spilling before she could stop them. "You didn't leave." "I told you," he whispered. "I don't break promises." She pressed her forehead to his hand, sobbing quietly, but not out of fear, not out of grief, out of something deeper, something cleaner. She looked up, eyes shining through tears, and said the word that had been growing inside her for weeks, trying to find its way out. "Papa." He blinked, then nodded. Once, like a mountain shifting under snow. Outside, the creek ran free. Inside, so did she. The thunder rolled in with a growl low and wide, stretching over the mountains like the voice of something old and watchful. The sky darkened in the middle of the day, clouds thick and bruised, pressing down on the pines until they bent in the wind. Rain followed hard and fast, beating against the cabin roof like fists. Inside, Clara Belle doubled over, both hands clutching the edge of the table, her face pale and wet with sweat. "It's time," she said through clenched teeth, the words barely a whisper. Agnes was already there, as if she'd known without being told. She'd brought 2 townswomen with steady hands and calm eyes, women who had each delivered half their own children by lantern light. One took the water from the hearth, another laid out clean rags and old quilts. Agnes rolled up her sleeves. Silas hovered near the door at first, eyes wide with something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness, fear that didn't come from violence or wounds, but from love too big to control. Clara met his eyes once, just once, and gave him the smallest nod. He backed away without a word and stepped outside into the storm. The wind tore at his coat. Rain soaked his shoulders. He dropped to his knees beside the oak tree and placed his hands in the mud like he was grounding himself to the earth. His lips moved, words swallowed by the thunder. Names. Annie, Sarah. If you're listening, watch over her. Watch over them both. The wind didn't answer, but the trees stood steady. Inside, the hours stretched. The pain came hard, relentless. Clara screamed once, then bit down on it, letting the sound shake in her chest instead of her throat. Agnes coached her through the waves, voice calm, fingers sure. The baby didn't come easy. It was the kind of labor that could break a girl or remake her. Agnes kept checking. Then, finally, she nodded. "Push now, she's ready." The next cry wasn't Clara's. It was high and shrill, filling the cabin like a hymn, raw, alive, undeniable. The storm still raged outside, but for a moment it was silenced by that sound, the first breath of a new life. Agnes swaddled the baby in the same quilt Clara had stitched with yellow thread and faded stars. She cleaned her gently, checked her fingers, her toes, then opened the door. Silas stood drenched, his beard dripping, hands at his sides. Agnes held out the bundle. "She's here," she said softly. "She's whole, and she's yours." He stepped forward like a man who wasn't sure if he deserved to touch what he'd been given. Then he took the baby in his arms. She blinked up at him with cloudy blue eyes, her tiny mouth still working out the shape of the world. "She looks like Clara," he whispered. Agnes smiled. "And maybe a little like Annie." He didn't speak again, just held the child against his chest, his giant hands cradling her head, his lips brushing her forehead as if to bless her with something words never could. Behind him, the thunder began to quiet. The thunder rolled in with a growl, low and wide, stretching over the mountains like the voice of something old and watchful. The sky darkened in the middle of the day, clouds thick and bruised, pressing down on the pines until they bent in the wind. Rain followed hard and fast, beating against the cabin roof like fists. Inside, Clara Belle doubled over, both hands clutching the edge of the table, her face pale and wet with sweat. "It's time," she said through clenched teeth, the words barely a whisper. Agnes was already there, as if she'd known without being told. She'd brought 2 townswomen with steady hands and calm eyes, women who had each delivered half their own children by lantern light. One took the water from the hearth. Another laid out clean rags and old quilts. Agnes rolled up her sleeves. Silas hovered near the door at first, eyes wide with something he hadn't felt in years: helplessness. Fear that didn't come from violence or wounds, but from love too big to control. Clara met his eyes once, just once, and gave him the smallest nod. He backed away without a word and stepped outside into the storm. The wind tore at his coat. Rain soaked his shoulders. He dropped to his knees beside the oak tree and placed his hands in the mud like he was grounding himself to the earth. His lips moved, words swallowed by the thunder. Names. Annie, Sarah. If you're listening, watch over her. Watch over them both. The wind didn't answer, but the trees stood steady. Inside, the hours stretched. The pain came hard, relentless. Clara screamed once, then bit down on it, letting the sound shake in her chest instead of her throat. Agnes coached her through the waves, voice calm, fingers sure. The baby didn't come easy. It was the kind of labor that could break a girl or remake her. Agnes kept checking. Then, finally, she nodded. "Push now. She's ready." The next cry wasn't Clara's. It was high and shrill, filling the cabin like a hymn, raw, alive, undeniable. The storm still raged outside, but for a moment it was silenced by that sound, the first breath of a new life. Agnes swaddled the baby in the same quilt Clara had stitched with yellow thread and faded stars. She cleaned her gently, checked her fingers, her toes, then opened the door. Silas stood drenched, his beard dripping, hands at his sides. Agnes held out the bundle. "She's here," she said softly. "She's whole, and she's yours." He stepped forward like a man who wasn't sure if he deserved to touch what he'd been given. Then he took the baby in his arms. She blinked up at him with cloudy blue eyes, her tiny mouth still working out the shape of the world. "She looks like Clara," he whispered. Agnes smiled. "And maybe a little like Annie." He didn't speak again, just held the child against his chest, his giant hands cradling her head, his lips brushing her forehead as if to bless her with something words never could. Behind him, the thunder began to quiet.